Hi everyone. Today we will have this webinar about new CLP rules for substances with more than one constituents. We have several subjects on this. We start with the definitions to make sure that we all know what these new CLP rules on which type of substances it applies to. Then we will look into the classification of these type of substances. How does this classification be determined? And also if these substances are used in a mixture, on how the classification of the mixture is determined. After that, we're going to look at the safety data sheet. What are the consequences of these new type of substances that are introduced in the CLP revision? What the influence is on the safety data sheet, and what's important for you as a company to ensure that you have the correct information in your safety data sheets after these new rules. So how do you communicate this in the supply chain? And let's start with the definitions. Well, before I'm going to talk about substances, specifically, we want to make sure that we know what the difference is between the substances and a mixture. So what is exactly a mixture? A mixture is when you have a formulation and you choose to have substance A and substance B and substance C as example, that you intend with intention add these substances together as a percentage of 20%, 30%, 50%, and together they form one mixture. However, if you look at a substance with more than one constituent, you have multiple chemical identities also within this substance. However, the substance is obtained with processes such as distillation and extraction. And the substance contains, for example, additives that keeps the main constituent stable, or it contains also constituents that are impurities. So these are in really low concentration present in the substance. Or it is a substance that has multiple constituents that is more looks like a mixture but is not. So for example, if you look at a process like distillation from a plant, you will extract the substance with more than one constituent that can have multiple constituents. And in this case, because on how it is obtained, it will be seen by REACH and CLP legislation as one substance and defined as a substance with more than one constituents. And from now on, I will use the abbreviation MOCS to make it a little bit easier during the presentation, so keep that in mind. So how does the classification of a MOCS gets determined now with the CLP revision? So first, we need to make sure that we know if we're looking at a MOCS or a mixture. If you're sure it's a MOCS, then you have to gather the information on the MOCS itself. That can be experimental data, but is often not available. Or you have to gather the information on the constituents themselves. So you need to know the composition, so how many constituents you have, in which percentages are they present, and you need to know the classifications of the constituents. Now, as an example of these type of MOCS are hydrocarbons and essential oils, and these are very, very complex substances. They have a lot of different constituents present, and they can even be variable in composition. So, and that really depends on the source. So for example, the timing, where it is exactly obtained, and also on the process itself, on how these, why these have variable compositions. So when you have gathered this information, you can determine the classification. Basically, if you don't have experimental data from the MOCS itself, which is often the case, you have to use the mixture calculation rules based on information from the constituents. So then you still approach it as a mixture, even though within REACH and CLP regulation, it is seen as a substance. However, this is an exception. There's an exception for a couple of hazard classes. For example, CMR substances, which are carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reprotoxic hazards. The endocrine disrupting hazards for human health and environment, and the characteristics like persistence, bioaccumulation, biodegradation, and mobility. And these can influence the hazard classes PBT, PMT, and aquatic toxicity. The exception is described as that the strictest classification approach determines the classification that are mentioned here. So, for example, I said previously that if you have experimental data, that is the one that determines the classification. So, for example, if you have skin irritation, that is in this case not the case because you have experimental data that concludes that this is not the case. However, if you would look at the constituent and you would calculate the classification, you would have skin irritation, then that does not overrule the experimental data. For CMR and all of the other hazard classes that are mentioned in the exception, the mixture calculation can overrule the experimental data. So that is what we mean with the strictest classification approach. Then, to make it a little bit more complicated, there's an exception on the exception, because this is not applicable yet for MOCS that are extracted from plants or plant parts, provided they are not chemically modified. In that case, experimental data can still overrule the mixture calculation rules. And in the CLP revision, it is mentioned that there will be a report be written within 5 years that would conclude how to deal exactly with these type of MOCS. So it's possible that in the future, when this report is published, that the MOCS in the end will follow the more the exception on the CMR classification, for example, but they can also introduce maybe even additional rules. We don't know yet. So this report will be published within 5 years. So because CLP revision is now in place, we already see that a lot of REACH dossiers of existing MOCS are already getting updated. And that the classification has changed. We see a lot of times that if there are no experimental data available, that the mixture calculation rules are applied, and suddenly some MOCS that already has a REACH dossier are updated to a more severe classification. Then if we would use these type of MOCS in a mixture, what happens then to the classification of the mixture if you look at the CLP revision? So I will show an example. For example, we have a MOCS and we are only going to look at the skin sensitization classification. For this MOCS, we don't have any experimental data, and the MOCS exists out of 3 different constituents. For 8%, it consists out of constituent A that has no hazard state, has skin sensitization, while the other 2 constituent does not. We will add this MOCS for 10% in a product, And for 90%, we add another substance that does not have any classification. So if we look at the situation before the CLP revision was in place, we would have to use the mixture calculation rules based on the classification of the MOCS itself. So if we look at the MOCS, it is present for 10%. 10% that is higher than the concentration limit of 1%, and therefore the product would be classified for skin sensitization. However, with the new CLP revision, we see that the mixture calculation rules are based on the classification of the constituents. So if you look at constituent A, it is present for 8% within the MOCS, and the MOCS is present for 10%. That means that the constituent A is present for 0.8% in the end product. 0.8% is lower than the 1%, which is the concentration limit of this classification, and therefore the end product is not classified in this case. However, the EUH 2H does apply in this case. So you can see that the classification gets less severe after the CLP revision because we have to look at the concentration of the constituents itself. However, there's one case where CLP revision is not exactly clear on. That is that if there is experimental data from the MOCS and it's available, which calculation method should then be used? Do we then use the mixture calculation rules based on the classification of the MOCS, or do we look at the constituents itself still? We have the question now asked at the help desk, and we hope to get an answer soon, and we will update on that when we have the answer. So this is the part of the CLP revision. So these are the new rules that is introduced. However, this will also influence the safety data sheets, and in which way. So the important bottleneck here is to realize that this is a CLP revision rules that I just explained, but on how the SDS should look like and what the rules are of the format of the SDS is under REACH legislation. And that has not been revised. So there's no mention of MOCS in the REACH regulation. So therefore, it can be up to interpretation on how to deal with the MOCS and how to deal with the constituents of the MOCS in an SDS. So if you look at section 2, for example, well, one of the more clear changes that we will see is that the classification can change, as I just explained in the example. But for the label elements, it could be questioned on if the contained sentence should only mention the MOCS, or should it mention the MOCS and the constituents? We are sure that the MOCS should be mentioned, as these are the substances that are present in the mixture. However, the constituents is a part of the MOCS. So is it then still mandatory to also mention the constituents in the contained sentence if that contributes to the classification of the mixture? And if we look at section 3, well, that should also mention the substances that contribute to the classification. And you have the same question. Should you then only mention the MOCS itself, or should you also mention the constituents? And if you decide to mention the constituents, then it should also be clear which are constituents of a MOCS and which substances are additionally added to the mixture. So for example, linalool is a substance that is present often in MOCS. So for example, some type of essential oil can have linalool present. However, linalool, you can also add it additionally to your mixture. And then it needs to be clear where the linalool comes from in section 3 to make sure on how to deal with the classification of the mixture. Another to sections that needs to take into account are the toxicological information, that's section 11, and the ecological information, that's section 12. As these have to explain per hazard what the hazard is based exactly on. So here we could also expect that the constituents are mentioned that would explain why the hazard is applicable or when it's not applicable. And the same goes for the ecological information for hazard classes as aquatic toxicity or the PBT and the PMT hazard class. You have to keep in mind with the CLP revision as a company when you receive SDSs from your suppliers. The first thing to keep in mind is that the CLP revision and these rules are applicable from July 2026, so that's the next month, coming month. And for existing products that are already on the market is July 2028. So if there's a possibility, or you know that there are MOCS in your products, or maybe if you don't know and you want to make sure, then it's good to request a new update of the SDS from your supplier. And when you receive them, to check the relevant sections for changes, as I just mentioned in the former sheet on where to look at in the SDS. It can be quite technical. So in case of any doubt, you can always contact us and we can help you with this. And as I also already mentioned, but I want to emphasize it here again, keep an eye on the REACH dossiers, because we already see that for MOCS the classification has changed. We also see that the REACH dossiers sometimes mention what the classification is based on, if it's based on experimental data or if it's based on the constituents, because this can influence on how to determine the classification when these MOCS are used in a mixture. So these are all the subjects I wanted to talk about. So I can imagine if that there are still questions, then you can always call us or email us. And we can also have an online meeting. So we have all our contact details here in the sheets. And hopefully see you next time. Thank you.